Hello friends, it's your boy ASCII GameCube Keyboard Controller, and it's time for Volume 10 of Obscure and Forgotten PS1 games. Play the excited children sound effect. Now, as a special treat for reaching the double digits, we're gonna do something a little different this episode, and also every subsequent 10 episodes from here on out, assuming that I make it that far. We'll cross the fingers, sure. So, the big twist is that we're gonna send the regular wheel of games on vacation for a temporary rest, which I think we can all agree is very much deserved. That means today's 4 games are all going to be selected from the viewer wheel. That's right, as a little thank you for all your support throughout the series, it's time for our first of hopefully many viewer specials. Sure, this is probably going to increase my risk of playing more bad pal exclusives, but hey, if it's for you guys, it's a risk I'm willing to take. Anyway, I'm sure this is gonna be another obnoxiously long video, but when isn't it, am I right? So let's not waste any more time. We've got some games to play, and today, you will provide.
You will provide.
There's a target in your immediate proximity! It has a marker on it, so assault teams, destroy all enemy anti-aircraft weaponry! But that's impossible! There are still targets remaining! Destroy every one of them!
So we're merely pawns in some elaborate game that will determine the fate of the world, is that it? Then which player is going to be fortunate enough to checkmate fate, I wonder?
Starting out our viewer special, we've got Silent Bomber, which first launched in Japan in 1999, before making its way to the West in the year 2000. This game was chosen for the wheel by 2 lovely people, Red Fox and Terra Corrupt, and I say lovely people because they chose an absolute banger of a game to talk about today. So, full disclosure, I've played this game a few times. In fact, it's one of those obscure games that I just so happened to stumble upon as a kid. I used to rent games a lot when I was younger, and when I came across this game in my local Extravision, RIP Sweet Prince, I knew just by looking at the box and the pictures on the back that I would really like this game, and surprise, surprise, I really like this game. That being said, in spite of owning a copy of this game for the past 15-ish years, I haven't played this game in about 15-ish years, and I don't know about you guys, but this whole being alive thing has made my memory kind of fuzzy, so playing it today will be a nice little refresher. But that begs the question, does Silent Bomber still hold up, and is it as good as I remember? Well, let's find out. Now, this game is developed by a little company called CyberConnect 2. You may know them as the guys who pump out a lot of anime fighters, and a lot might be a bit of an understatement, but I'm actually quite a fan of some of their other works as a studio, including the Dot Hack series of RPGs, the absolutely bonkers Asura's Wrath, and for the PS1 fans out there, they also made everybody's favorite furry platformer, Tail Concerto. And following on from Tail Concerto, we got Silent Bomber, a very different experience both in tone and gameplay. You see, in spite of the name, this isn't a very quiet game at all. In fact, it's a big dumb action game where you're constantly blowing stuff up. Robots, aliens, buildings, innocent civilians.
Those are... But I thought there were soldiers in here! These people are civilians!
Oh no, that got dark quick. So before we get into the gameplay, we might as well talk about the story. In Silent Bomber, we play as a character named Utah, like the state but with a silent J at the front. Utah is a genetically engineered man created by a military government for the purpose of covert military missions, spying, assassinations, all that good stuff. Interestingly, the game's tutorial acts as a sort of origin story, with Utah going through a training mission for his government, which sees him taking out a series of targets, ending up with him blowing up a base full of innocent civilians against his knowledge. It's a pretty harrowing scene, honestly, and I'm surprised to see a game pull a Spec Ops The Line many years before it, but yeah, hey, that's tutorials for you. This whole experience leads to Utah having a severe mental breakdown and eventually becoming an emotionless drone, only focused on completing his objectives, no matter the cost. Of course, fast forward a few years later, and the military government that created Utah has collapsed, and as such, Utah is now a prisoner due to committing just a few war crimes. But when the planet Utah is imprisoned on is under threat from a giant space cruiser known as the Dante, he is given a shot at redemption by joining a ragtag group of criminals in a sort of suicide squad to take down the ship from within. The story itself is rather predictable, but it's the right mixture of hokiness and seriousness that you'd want from a PS1 sci-fi action title, and the game is fully voiced too, with some decent performances from the cast, well, at least by 2000 standards. The story doesn't take up a huge chunk of the runtime really, but I always enjoyed the story segments whenever they did pop up, and the CGI scenes are also pretty nice too. They've definitely got that classic early 3D look to them, but they are very impressive all the same. Great stuff all around. Now, while the story stuff is appreciated, where Silent Bomber really shines is in its gameplay, which to this day is still rather unique amongst other games. A simple way to describe it would be kinda like a gritty sci-fi Bomberman, or the game Bomberman Act Zero wishes it was. So our moveset for Utah is pretty straightforward. We can jump, climb, and perform a dash mid-air by tapping the jump button twice in quick succession, helpful for covering ground and also getting out of danger, which generally speaking, you're going to be in quite a lot. And for your attacks, well, you've got bombs. You can drop a bomb on the spot, or if you hold down the bomb button, you can bring up a little targeting reticule that lets you lock onto enemies and instead plant bombs directly on them. Once you place the bomb, all you gotta do is press the triangle button and then it detonates. Nice and simple, eh? Now, there are a few other techniques to take into consideration too. For one, you can increase the power and range of your bombs by stacking them on top of one another. Early on in the game, you start out with just 2 bombs, but you can work your way up to a total of 8 consecutive bombs, and stacking bombs offers a significant boost in power, of course, with the trade-off being the increased time that they take to plant. But if you can make it work, the trade-off is nearly always worth it. On top of this, Utah also has access to 3 special bomb types, which, unlike your normal bombs, are limited and must be collected throughout the levels. These bombs include a napalm bomb, which continues to burn on the ground after detonation, great for sustained damage on bigger enemies, a stun bomb, which arcs out and locks mechanical enemies in place for a short period of time, and finally there's a gravity bomb, which sucks smaller enemies in and deals continuous damage to them over time. Needless to say, these special bombs are extremely powerful when used correctly, and they can even be stacked in a similar method to your normal bombs to increase their effect. Although one trade-off is that you can't use these bombs to lock on and place them on enemies, so you do gotta be more precise when using them. There's also various pickups you can find throughout the levels as well. There's of course the aforementioned special bombs, as well as various health pickups, which unsurprisingly restore your health. But more importantly, you can also find these things called E-chips. Now, E-chips are important because these are used for leveling up Utah. You can increase the total number of bombs you can plant at a time, increase the range of your lock-on, and increase your shield, which reduces the damage you take by 10% per level. You get a chance to assign these E-chips at the end of each mission, but if you like, you can also pause mid-mission and just rearrange them any way you like at any time, which is a nice feature. Now, the flow of gameplay in Silent Bomber is quite linear. You move from level to level one by one, and the levels themselves are generally quite compact, usually taking anywhere from 5 to 10 minutes on average, with the occasional boss fight at the end. Levels might require you to get from point A to point B, destroy a set number of targets, or do something like protect a target, but generally they're very straightforward and linear affairs with good level design and plenty of UI elements to let you know what you should or shouldn't be bombing, although you can't really go wrong with bombing everything and anything in this game, let me tell you. You see, while your main goal is usually just to make it to the end of a level in one piece, the game also has a fun scoring and ranking system for players who like a bigger challenge. Blowing stuff up gets you points, but blowing stuff up in quick succession gives you a multiplier, and keep this multiplier going and you get big points. You can chain this off enemies, environmental objects, bullets, pretty much anything really, and when you get to the end of a level, depending on how many points you've earned, how quick you made it there, and how much damage you took in the process, you'll get a rank from D to S. Now this ranking system is pretty tough, and even though I feel like I played pretty well during my playthrough, I never got anything higher than a B, so this ranking system is no joke, but for replayability purposes, this is the kind of thing that you really love to see. And I suppose, speaking of difficulty, one of the things I remembered the most about this game was that it was very, very tough, and honestly, playing through the first few levels of this game, I thought maybe it was just me who was bad as a kid, because while this game was absolutely keeping me on my toes, I was still blasting through this game with relative ease. Although, from the midpoint onwards, the game's difficulty rapidly began to put me in my place, and some repressed memories quickly came rushing back to me. The alien boss, the elevator level, the protection mission at the end, and oh my god, the final boss. These are all brutally difficult, but at the same time, completely fair. It's a tough game, but at the end of the day, it's nothing a bit of skill and pattern recognition can't overcome. That may be a D rank, but I worked pretty hard for them, let me tell you. Now, playing this game from start to finish and getting through its 14 levels took me about 2 hours altogether. Not the longest campaign by any means, but truly, it's a game that's all killer no filler. Well, I could have done without the protection mission, truthfully, but everything else was top notch. It doesn't outstay its welcome, and if anything, it actually makes you want to hop straight back in and try and get a better rank, and that is something you might want to do because there's also another mode that we've got to talk about. Now, throughout the game, while searching for E-chips to upgrade your abilities, you may also come across these items called data chips. Now, at first, these don't seem to do anything, but if you return to the main menu, you'll see a mode called VR Arena, which is a very cool addition to the game. This mode lets you both battle against and play as a bunch of the enemies and bosses featured throughout the main game, both in CPU and 2-player battles, with each character featuring its own unique moveset. And to unlock these characters, you guessed it, you gotta find the data chips hidden throughout the main game. Now, I managed to find all but one of these during my playthrough, but the final 3 characters you can only unlock by beating every level with a B, A, and S rank respectively, which, as you can see, I didn't have time to do. But hey, this mode is actually really fun, all things considered. It turns the game into a fun little arena fighter and gives you a really nice incentive to actually earn those high ranks in single player. Definitely one of the cooler additions I've seen in a PS1 game, that's for sure. And with that, all that's left to really talk about is the presentation and sound, and really, presentation wise, I think this game knocks it out of the park. Whether it's the effects, the character designs, the smaller enemies, the big boss mechs and aliens, or the many locations you'll visit across the space cruiser Dante, this game gives you so much variety in such a short period of time. You'd never even have guessed that this game takes place in just one single location. Well, outside of the tutorial mission, of course, but the less we speak about that, the better. There's a few locations in particular that are just framed so perfectly when you enter them, it's hard not to take a moment to admire them. And also, some of the visuals during the final boss in particular are incredible, if a little busy and distracting, but hey, you'll get used to them. It's just an expertly crafted, well-designed and clean-looking game that runs at a rock-solid 30 frames per second the whole way through. Visually, there is pretty much nothing to fault here. And as for the sound, well, all the sound effects and voices are great. As I said before, the voice acting is above average from what you'd expect from a game of its era, but that still means you can expect a little cheesiness from time to time, as is tradition, especially from the villains.
You're telling me that Hornet assault teams got on board the ship? All right. Go to alert level yellow. Eliminate the intruders immediately.
And when it comes to the music, it's a bit of a weird one. I think it's really good, right? But in a way, I also kind of wish it was better. It's a tough one to explain because while I felt the compositions are catchy and they suit the action and pace of the game well, whenever I listen to them outside of the game, I'm just not really all that into them. I think it might have something to do with the recording quality or the tools or instruments used to create the music, but I don't know, I always felt like it could have been a bit stronger or punchier, seeing as it's a CD-based game. That being said, I still did really enjoy it while playing the game, which is the main thing really, but hey, have a listen and see for yourself.
this time. Damn it! Losing power! I can't believe this guy!
So yeah, that's a look at Silent Bomber, and how does it hold up after all these years? Honestly, if anything, I think I like it even more now. It plays excellently, offers a great challenge, and the gameplay here still really hasn't ever been emulated since. It's an all-killer, no-filler action game with a silly story, cool sci-fi environments, and enough explosions to make Michael Bay jealous. I often consider this game to be the most popular Obscure PS1 game, at least in my mind, because while not many people have played it, the people who have usually can't shut up about it, and look, that's for good reason. So if you've been sleeping on Silent Bomber all this time, there is absolutely no better time to wake up and play this absolute belter of a PS1 exclusive.
You will provide.
Is it possible to stop the Con-Human Violence Organization, which joined forces with human clones? Wave Rider. Cybernetics Link. Cloning. Out of control.
Improvement over 100%.
RayCrisis.
Next up, we're taking a look at RayCrisis, which made its way to the PlayStation in the year 2000, courtesy of legendary arcade developer Taito. This game was chosen for the wheel by JetWolf68K, which is possibly one of the most badass usernames around.
Lovely stuff.
Now, as some of you may know, Taito, they like to dabble in the old shoot-'em-up genre from time to time. Hell, they only went and laid the whole blueprint for it in 1978 with Space Invaders, but beyond that, Taito also worked on some other notable series, such as Darius, aka the horizontal fish one, and also the Ray series, aka the vertical cybervirus one. Unsurprisingly, today's game is a part of the Ray series. Now, up until this point, despite being a relatively big shoot-'em-up fan, I'd never played a game in the Ray series, or at least that's what I thought. You see, the series is made up of 3 games originally released in arcades. The first is a game called Ray Force, which was released in 1994 and is the only 2D game in the series. Following that up in 1996, we then got Ray Storm, which took the series into 3D for the first time, and then after that in 1998 we got RayCrisis, the final entry in the series, which actually acts as a prequel to the first game. Now, to my surprise, not only have I played the first game Ray Force, but I actually own it too. You see, when this game was ported to home consoles due to licensing issues, it was ported under not just one, but 2 different names. In Japan, the home console version was known as Layer Section, and in the West it was known as Galactic Attack. And like any self-respecting Saturn owner, most of my collection is made up of cheap Japanese games, and naturally, I just so happen to own a copy of Layer Section. So yeah, it turns out, unbeknownst to me, I've dabbled in this series many times. And also, in case you're wondering, there is another Ray game from Taito called Ray Tracers, which, as far as I know, isn't related to this series in any way, but does involve you fighting bosses by driving into them, so that's kinda rad. Anyway, we should probably move on to the game, so here's RayCrisis, which on the PlayStation also has the new subtitle of RayCrisis Series Termination. As we already mentioned, RayCrisis is a 3D vertical shoot 'em up that plays on a 2D plane. Certainly nothing unusual for the genre. Move your ship around, dodge bullets, and blow up the enemy. It's about as bread and butter as it gets. The game utilizes a total of 3 buttons during gameplay, one for your standard projectile shot, which hits all enemies on the same plane as your ship. Another is to use your lock-on laser, which is kind of this series' main gimmick. You can paint targets using this little target reticule in front of your ship, and then tap the laser button to launch them all at once. This can target enemies on any plane, by the way, so as you can imagine, you'll be using this quite a lot. And finally, there's also a button for your screen clearing bomb, which is known as the round divider. This unleashes a blast that makes you temporarily invincible, clears all bullets on the screen, kills all minor enemies, and does massive damage to bigger enemies and bosses. It's not the flashiest looking bomb in the world, but hey, it gets the job done. You can only hold one of these at a time, by the way, but you can recharge it by killing enemies or just by dying, and if you're like me, you'll probably be dying a lot in this game. So that's pretty much the basic fundamentals of gameplay: shoot, laser, and bomb. But of course, there's much more to RayCrisis than that. First off, we've got 3 different ships to choose from, each with the choice of 4 different colors, which is always a nice touch. Each ship has a different shot and laser type, which actually does change up the gameplay quite a bit. For example, our default ship adopts the series standard laser fire, while the next ship allows you to fire a lightning laser that can be guided around the screen for extra damage, while another has homing bullets and a lock-on shot that can be fired indefinitely, assuming you can tap the fire button quick enough, that is. The different weapon types feel unique enough to give each ship its own identity, with each offering up enough individual pros and cons that one doesn't seem overtly better than the other, and it really all just comes down to personal preference. And regardless, no matter what ship you pick, they all move at the same speed and die in one hit anyway, so yeah, just go with what you like. As for items, the red pickups power up your basic shot, the green items increase the number of lock-ons you can use, and these rare blue items power up both weapon and laser 3 levels, so definitely grab these if you can. Now you might be wondering about all this stuff on the hood, and yeah, this is something I had to look into after my first run through of the game, so let's try break it all down for you. So at the bottom left, we got our lives, bomb gauge, and also our lock-on counter. Certain ships can have higher lock-on numbers than others, but if you ever want to check how many you've got, this gauge will let you know. And over on the right, we got our score and also something called the encroachment gauge. Now the encroachment gauge is actually quite important. When you start the game, this gauge begins at 50%. Killing enemies brings the gauge down, and the lower the gauge is when you finish a mission, the more points you get. If the gauge gets up to 100% though, well then things are going very poorly, let's just put it that way. Kill as many enemies as you can and take out the bosses quickly, and you should be able to keep things in check no problem. If you manage to finish a level with 20% or less on the gauge, the next level will then spawn in a bunch of harder enemies that give you more points, although you do need to be pretty good to make this actually happen. And speaking of points, we might as well talk about the game's scoring system. So generally speaking, killing enemies with your laser gives you more points than your standard shot, so the goal is really to try maximize the use of your laser over your shot whenever possible. Now chaining large lock-ons with your laser is the key to scoring big points. The more you lock on in one go, the bigger your chain will be, although when dealing with bigger enemies, there's also a technique you can utilize called hyper laser, where if you use all your lock-ons on a single target simultaneously, you unleash a powered up version called a hyper laser, and if you kill your enemy with this attack, you get a big score bonus, as you can see here in the top left. Now this only applies to ships with the standard lock-on. If you're playing with the WR-03 for example, this ship uses a completely different scoring system based on chaining as many shots as possible in a limited time frame, and promotes a very different playstyle compared to the other ships, and if done well, can lead to some crazy scores. Now, needless to say, I did not do very well with it, so vanilla lock-on is fine for me, thank you very much. So yeah, as you can see, while the game seems pretty straightforward on the surface, as with many shoot 'em ups, once you dig into the systems and mechanics underneath, you begin to appreciate all of its unique traits that give each game their own personal flair. Talking about personal flair, we haven't even really talked about the levels yet, which are pretty crazy. So there is actually a plot to RayCrisis that revolves around a supercomputer gaining sentience, and your ship is a computer virus known as a Wave Rider that's trying to take it out from within. It's a little wild to be honest, but it definitely results in some really cool Y2K cyber aesthetics and imagery all throughout the game, which you absolutely love to see. Now interestingly, when you start the game, you actually get to choose the order of the levels that you play. Well, kinda. You always begin in the first area called Self, which is kind of like a little warm-up for the main course. Then you get to choose 3 levels out of a total of 5 levels, named Emotion, Consciousness, Intelligence, Memory, or Consideration. You can choose these in any order, and if you like, you can even play the same level 3 times in a row. It's up to you. Once you beat these levels, you then take on the 5th and final level to round out the game. Now these levels are all generally quite short. The actual level part only takes about a minute or 2 in total, with the majority of each level actually being taken up by a boss battle at the end. Really, a full run through of this game from start to finish should take most people anywhere from 15 to 20 minutes. It is very, very short. Of course, you can go back and try a few different levels to spice things up, but seeing every level this game has to offer and playing through it with each available ship, you're looking at about an hour at most really, which may be a good thing or bad thing depending on how long you like your shoot 'em ups to be. Of course, the main draw here is really playing the game multiple times so you can learn the patterns, find the best routes, perfect your techniques, and just not die if you can help it. And let me tell you, holy crap, this game is tough. I was not prepared for how punishing some of the bullet patterns in this game are. It does absolutely not hold your hand in the slightest, and while some levels and bosses are quite manageable, a few others would kill me multiple times within seconds of respawning. It is brutal. Of course, the more I played, the better I got, and also having infinite continues, that certainly helps too. But if you're not familiar with shoot 'em ups, just be prepared. This game is quite mean. Now keeping all that in mind, that's just the normal mode that we talked about. If you like, there's also a console specific special mode, which is actually my favorite way to play through the game. This mode tasks you with taking on every single level in a set order. Now, in this mode, your ship is constantly at max power, but the catch is you have no continues and start with no lives, and instead of collecting weapon power-ups, you collect points and extra lives as you progress through the game to help you last a little bit longer each time. This mode also features remixed visuals and music, and even an exclusive level variant not seen in the normal mode. And I dunno, maybe it was always being at max power, the longer runtime, and the constant tension of getting a game over, but this felt like the best way to play the game in my opinion. I even managed to beat it eventually. Granted, it probably helped that I played through the normal mode about 5 or 6 times beforehand, but hey, it's a nice victory. I'll take it. Also, to round out the fun additions to the console version, you can also unlock the Wave Riders from the previous Ray games by beating normal mode with all 3 default ships. They play pretty much like the other ships, but their bomb animations are much cooler in my opinion, so they are absolutely worth getting. Also, there's an art gallery too, because why the hell not? And I suppose, speaking of art, we should probably talk about the game's looks and presentation, and personally, I love the visuals and style that this game has. It pops with all that cool Y2K hacker cyber aesthetic across the menus and in the game's visuals. Now, there is often a lot going on, which truthfully can be a bit much for your eyes during gameplay, but as a late release 3D shoot 'em up on the console, this one is top tier in the visual department, and not only that, it aims to run at 60 frames per second as well. Now, I say aim because it does dip pretty frequently when the action gets hectic, but even then, the game only ever really drops into the 50s, so while the odd stutter is noticeable, the game still runs at a blistering pace throughout. And even though I really like the visuals and the levels, as brief as they are, like most shoot 'em ups, the stars of the show are undoubtedly the bosses you'll fight throughout. Big, hulking mechanical enemies with multiple parts to lock on and destroy. Even though these guys will wreck you, it's hard not to admire their designs while they're doing it. As for the sound, well, the game is chock full of lock-on noises and laser sound effects as you'd expect, all of which sound great by the way. The music is also excellent. It's one of the more unusual soundtracks I've heard in a shoot 'em up. It's definitely full of bangers, but I'd actually liken it somewhat to Taito's other soundtracks from games like G Darius, and that it's a bit more experimental than your average game, and the tracks even get remixed as you move throughout a level, escalating the music more and more as you move towards the boss. It's a really nice touch and makes the music one of the most memorable aspects of the game for sure. So that's RayCrisis, and I'll be honest, it did actually take me a little while to warm up to this one. Early playthroughs left me focused on the difficulty and short runtime more than anything, but as usual, once I came to better understand the mechanics, find a preferred wave rider, and nail down some of the enemy patterns, I started having a really fun time with this one, especially in the trial mode, which is honestly where I think the game shines the brightest. It doesn't reinvent the wheel, but I think this is a game that will definitely appeal to shoot 'em up fans looking for an aesthetically striking game with solid fundamentals and challenging gameplay. But on the other hand, the high difficulty and very short runtime could turn off more casual players, and going by the price this game fetches online for a physical copy, unless you plan on trying it some other way, I think only the hardcore will be playing this one anyway. That being said, if you did want to pick this game up physically, the best way to do it in my opinion would be to get both it and its predecessor Raystorm in a duo pack released under the Simple series, volume number 75, the double shooting to be exact. Also, the Japanese version of this game includes a Pocket Station minigame called Pocket Ray, which is a really cool addition. So if you have a Pocket Station and the ability to play Japanese discs, this is absolutely the way to go. So if you have the means to play it, RayCrisis Series Termination is another fine shoot 'em up from Taito and worthy of being added to any genre fan's collection. Plus, you know, it's got drum and bass too, so it was always gonna get a pass from me.
You will provide.
Kicking off our second half of volume numero 10, we've got Johnny Bazookatone, which made its way to the PlayStation in the beginning of 1996. This game was chosen for the wheel by Parka Monkey, not to be confused with the other Parka Monkey who is still trapped in IKEA to this very day. So, Johnny Bazookatone. This is one of those games that I remember seeing a lot of when I was a kid, and it might have also probably helped that it came out on pretty much all major consoles available at the time. It actually first launched on the 3DO, and like most major 3DO releases, was quickly ported over to the PlayStation and Saturn, so you know they could actually make some money. The developers behind this game are a British studio called Arc Developments, who developed 442 Soccer, a football game nobody has ever heard of, and also Hurricanes, a football platformer on the Mega Drive that nobody has ever heard of.
Coming up, watch it, watch the football, watch it, it's gonna move, watch the football, it's football!
Johnny Bazookatone, on the other hand, is not a football game, but it is a platformer, a 2D platformer, harkening back to the classics of the 16-bit era, but instead offering up some fancy 32-bit graphics and sound. Honestly, it was a bit of a risky move doing a 2D platformer back in 1996. This was the period where simply just making a 2D game was usually a death sentence both critically and commercially, but hey, we're older and wiser now and don't judge games based on their graphics anymore, right? Right? Yeah, well, let's see how Johnny Bazookatone holds up all these years later. Now, like most games named after a character, we play as said titular character, Johnny Bazookatone, the purple-haired musician. The story here is that in the not too distant future of 2050, Johnny Bazookatone is essentially some sort of musical genius who's so good he can unite the entire world in peace. Now this makes El Diablo, the king of the underworld, very jealous, so he sets out to steal Johnny's precious guitar, known as Anita, for himself. He succeeds, but since he has no music in his soul and can't play the guitar very well at all, this enrages El Diablo so much that he decides to deprive the world of music altogether. So he kidnaps all of the world's biggest musical geniuses. We've got the rock god, the techno god, the jazz god, and the soul god. But our main man Johnny manages to evade capture and instead follows the devil to the gates of the underworld, guitar gun in hand, to free the legends of music and regain his one true love, Anita, his guitar. Honestly, for a throwaway story in a platformer, this is a pretty fun concept, although outside of a few short cutscenes in between levels, we really don't have to worry too much about the story for the rest of the game. Also, I just want to take a moment to highlight how awful the North American box art is for this game. Like, I know the PAL box art is also kind of plain, but it's just so much more aesthetically pleasing to my eyes, although neither can really top the Japanese box art. I mean, look at this thing. The game's also just called Johnny Bazooka over there, which is kind of funny. So, onto the gameplay, and yep, we got ourselves a pretty traditional platformer here. Jumping and shooting is the name of the game. Move from one level to the next, fight the occasional boss, and then get a password when you beat an area. All that good stuff. There's a grand total of 5 areas to visit, each with their own kinda mini segments and levels within. Some of these areas are your basic linear affairs where your main goal is to get all the way from the left of the screen to the right of the screen, but the majority are actually larger locations where you need to complete a few different objectives or find some specific items. I've mentioned this on the channel before, but European-made 2D platformers often have this specific style. There's usually an abundance of items to collect and level design that is somewhat unorthodox, and almost everything in the game is out to kill you, and Johnny Bazookatone is very much that style of game. Now, before we get into the nitty gritty, let's talk a little bit about Johnny's movement and abilities. Now, we've got our standard jump button, which lets you jump. We've got a fire button that lets us fire Johnny's guitar, which is automatic, has infinite ammo, and can be aimed in a bunch of different directions. It's basically Earthworm Jim's blaster, but in guitar form. And you know what? Ain't nothing wrong with that. You can also do a powered up attack by holding down the triangle button. Just give me a second. Any moment now. Alright, there it is. There's also a button for sucking up items with your guitar, and if you press it again, you can spit them back out. Now, the next few moves we're going to cover are probably the most important in the game. There is a melee attack that is activated by pressing the R1 button. It's a sort of spinning hop attack that propels Johnny in the air a little bit. Now, this move on its own isn't too exciting, but holding down this button is also how you make Johnny run. Now, you're going to need this to cross more than a few gaps in the game, and you'll be doing it in tandem with the game's most important maneuver, which is the hover shot. Whenever you're in the air, if you point your gun down and hold the shoot button, you'll hover in the air. Now, this move is heavily momentum based and truthfully also a little bit finicky, but I kinda love it. And that's pretty much it for Johnny's moves. There's no other weapons or power-ups, just little old Johnny and his trusty guitar gun, vacuum thing. As for items, well, the main collectible are music notes, which come in big and little varieties. Little ones give you 1 note, and big ones give you 10. And if you collect 1,000, you get an extra life. But a much easier way of getting an extra life is just collecting a Johnny head if you see him. There's also these stars, which restore Johnny's health. Now, you can have a maximum of 5 health points at a time, and the bronze stars give you 1 point back, silver give you 2, and gold give you 3. And finally, we got rainbow notes. Now, these are hidden throughout each stage, and collecting them all gives you big bonus points, which are mostly just for show really, but if you collect all the notes in order, you get brought to a special bonus stage, which I never accomplished even once, so I'm afraid I have no footage of that to show you. So now that we've covered everything really, let's talk about the game. It's very, very hard. Johnny Bazookatone is a game that's quite difficult by design, but also quite difficult because it is poorly designed on top of that. First things first, let's talk about the graphics. Now, the game opts for that digitized look that was oh so popular during the mid-90s, and truthfully, it's not all that bad really. I quite like a lot of the sprites and visual design seen throughout the game, even if it opts for an overly dark color palette a lot of the time, but the problem is that it's one of those games where not everything is very clear. Can I walk on this thing? Is this thing gonna hurt me? Can I fire through this thing? It's very, very inconsistent and often leads to you falling through a lot of platforms and taking a lot of damage that you didn't expect, and more importantly, it makes you move very cautiously and second guess almost everything that you do, which is really the last thing you want in a platformer. Plus, it doesn't help that pretty much everything is out to get you as well. Now these issues are also compounded by a few other things, namely some floaty movement and asshole enemies. So Johnny's default speed, it's kinda slow. Johnny's run speed on the other hand, kinda fast. If you run, you're probably gonna run into an enemy. But even if you want to run, you can't do that without first doing this little hop, and that little hop will often propel you into stuff or off platforms. Truthfully, it's not the worst control you'll ever see in a 2D platformer, but there's a lot of things about it that make it not great. Manageable, but not great. And speaking of manageable, but not great, the enemies in this game, mostly assholes. A lot of them are very small and difficult to nail down, and even more of them are inexplicably invincible for short periods of time, meaning you gotta time your shots to damage them during certain windows, which they will almost always use to damage you back in some way too. These ball enemies that split into multiple little balls are absolutely the worst offenders, and how often they pack like 2 of them into a single room is downright criminal. Honestly, if it wasn't for the very generous invincibility period that you get after getting damage, I would have died so many more times in this game than I already did. It got to the point that it was just easier to kinda edge forward and get enemies into my field of view so I could take them out with a charged attack ahead of time, but that also meant waiting for the charge attack, so, you know, it was a lose-lose situation really. Bosses at the very least weren't all that difficult to take out, although pretty much all of them bar the surgeon and final boss have really boring patterns, but hey, I'll take that over being frustrated any day of the week. Now truthfully, all that stuff I can actually live with, but the thing that really bothered me the most about this game is that the levels are just so damn confusing. It's not even about knowing where to go, it's just wondering what to do. The first level in the penitentiary is pretty straightforward, save for some weird platforming towards the end, but pretty much every level beyond that will have you scratching your head more than a few times. The hotel is a massive vertical level that requires you to move suitcases around and travel through portals, suck up some soap to kill one specific enemy who lets you fix some elevators to move more suitcases to get a ticket to pass a bouncer. I don't want to talk about how long it took me to do all this. The next level has a kitchen segment where you gotta push eggs and flour dotted across the level into a cauldron to blast out of there. It was not fun. The next level after that sees you traveling back and forth collecting viruses in a weird vehicle that's stuck in some pipes. It's not like it's even tough, it's just the whole thing is so odd and confusing. Also, every time you transition from a screen, you get a prolonged loading screen, of which you'll probably spend 30% of this level looking at. And the final level is quite literally a single screen that lasts about 30 seconds before you fight El Diablo. It's quite the ride. Also, check out this cutscene when you beat the final boss and get your guitar back. It's something. I don't know about you guys, but Johnny might be having sex with this guitar. At least, that's what the cutscene seems to be implying anyway. Also, if you happen to notice that sick solo in the background there, we should probably talk about the definitive highlight of Johnny Bazookatone. The music is absolutely amazing. Now, you'd expect the music in a game all about a musical legend and his kidnapped musical friends to be pretty good, and you'd be right, but I was kind of taken aback by how good it actually is. It's got elements of rock and roll, funk, jazz, soul, trip-hop, techno, and it is, without a doubt, the best part of this game. It can make even the worst levels bearable. Also, special shout out to the end credits theme, which doesn't seem to be on YouTube anywhere, but is absolutely one of the best tracks in the whole game. That being said though, I'm still not exactly sure what's up with the weird chicken song that's in the third level that features bottles clinking and cows mooing during the song. Well, that's Johnny Bazookatone. It's not a very long game, taking about 9 or so minutes to beat, and you know what? It's absolutely not the worst game in the world. It's enjoyable in parts, has some fun mechanics and interesting visuals, but really most of the time, it's just not very fun to play. It's a game that feels like a relic from a bygone era. You know, all those annoying platformers that came out during the 16-bit era, your Bubsies and your, I don't know, Wayne's World, where you just never really feel comfortable playing it. You're always kinda on edge for one reason or another, or just downright confused too. I feel like this type of platformer was already outdated well before this game came out, and all these years later, a lot of its issues are even more glaring, especially when comparing it to its contemporaries on the platform. Although, if we're looking at it from the perspective of a 3DO game, it's kinda good for a 3DO platformer, I guess. So yeah, not the worst thing I've ever played, but I would have a really hard time recommending it to anybody. I'd imagine most people would probably tap out by the second level, and it is a shame since you'd be missing out on the excellent soundtrack hidden away within, but fret not, some versions of the game actually come with the soundtrack on CD, and honestly, if you can get that cheap, it might be worth buying just for that alone. You get a mediocre game alongside some great music, and you know what? That's a pretty good deal in my book.
You will provide.
Once upon a time, a blue-eyed boy from the Old West learned one of life's cruelest lessons, that evil was bigger than his gun. So he followed the footsteps of a mysterious master to the Far East, where he learned the secrets of the sword and came back home with the heart of a gunman and the soul of a samurai.
Johnny had a dream of being the biggest hero round. There wouldn't be an enemy that he could not put down with a gun. Well, then one day Johnny met his match and turned his world around. He changed his name and learned the Shogun way, a land of the rising sun, rising day.
Son, this is the last test and my final lesson for you.
Johnny knows.
Samurai Gunman.
Ladies and gentlemen, give it up for our final game in this volume, Rising Zan, the Samurai Gunman, which first made its way to the PlayStation in March of 1999 in Japan before seeing a Western release in September of the very same year. This game was chosen for the wheel by Paul Durst, who I'm going to imagine is Fred Durst's son, and is in fact doing this all for the nookie. Appreciate your contribution, Mr. Durst. So out of all the games we've played today, this is the one I knew the least about, other than the fact it's a game about a samurai gunman, which you'd think would have made me check this out sooner, but alas, sometimes when you see something cool, it's better to just leave it as a total surprise until someday it's chosen via somebody else's selection for said wheel, and well, here we are. Now, something else that caught me by surprise was the developer behind this game, a little company called Universal Entertainment Planning Systems, or UEP Systems for short. These guys are the developers behind the Cool Borders series of games, and as far as I knew, that was the only series they ever worked on, except for one lone standout, Rising Zan, the Samurai Gunman, an action title that is a love letter to both classic Wild West and samurai media, and also perhaps one of the most insane games ever released on the PlayStation. But as we all know, an insane game doesn't always make a good game, so let's see what Rising Zan has in store for us all these years later. So this is Johnny, the fastest and best shooter in all the West, and a man obsessed with being a hero. A man who thought he was untouchable, until one day he was, touched, I guess. This led Johnny to travel to the land of the rising sun to study under a shogun master, where he learned the ways of the blade, changed his name, and became Rising Zan, the Samurai Gunman, and he is now returned to defeat evil once and for all. And really, as cool as that all sounds, it doesn't even come close to preparing you for what this game has in store. Because while I was expecting a somewhat generic and janky third-person action game, what I didn't expect was cat baseball, giant hands poking people until they explode, slot machines, and some of the wackiest quick-time events I have ever seen in a game. There's also something called Hustle Mode, which is, well, see for yourself. So yeah, pretty early into this game, it becomes quite apparent that this thing is like the blueprint for crazy character-driven action games like God Hand, Devil May Cry, and No More Heroes. Just imagine those games, but in super janky PS1 form, and that's pretty much Rising Zan. Now, I'm not saying this game was a direct influence for the creation of those games. I mean, considering how obscure this title was upon release, and still is to this day, it would be pretty silly to say that, but at the same time, I'm not saying it, you know? I think this alone probably makes Rising Zan one of the most interesting games in the whole PS1 library. It feels like a game that is in many ways ahead of its time, giving you a surprisingly skill-based combat system with an emphasis on getting big points to earn high rankings at the end of each level, but at the same time, it also doesn't take itself seriously in the slightest, throwing you from one wacky situation and combat encounter to the next, while not being afraid to mix up the gameplay at the drop of a hat. And not only that, it is genuinely very funny too. Now, taking all this into consideration, you'd wonder why this game wasn't a bigger deal when it first came out, and honestly, the answer comes down to one thing. Nobody really knew how to make a game like this yet, and while UEP Systems certainly made a valiant attempt, it's well, it's a PS1 game, alright, let's just put it that way. So I suppose the best way to get this across to you is to go through the various controls and combat in this game, and thankfully the training mission does a pretty good job of explaining everything to you. So this mission sees Johnny taking on his final test from his master before he officially becomes a samurai, and fun fact, the voice of Johnny's master is none other than Mario, Charles Martinet himself.
Defense is the most important thing. Keep that in mind.
That's fun. So this training mission gives us a bunch of challenges to test out our various abilities, from jumping over obstacles, defending and parrying, and taking out some little Mokujin dudes with both your sword and your gun. Now, all the basic abilities, jumping, slashing, shooting, blocking, are all done by pressing a single button, right? Nothing out of the ordinary here. Well, as long as you consider spinning a blade to hover as your double jump, ordinary that is. All your special abilities though, like parrying or your various sword or gun abilities, are done by double tapping a direction before pressing the input. For example, parrying is forward, forward, or 1. To spin your blade in a circle, you press left, right, X. To dash forward with your sword, press forward, forward, X. Want to do a jumping spin attack? Back forward X. You can do these attacks at any time as long as you have some of this blue meter next to your health, which thankfully regenerates pretty quickly between moves. Now, I've been critical of these types of inputs in the past in certain, action games, but in this case, I think they actually work quite well because there are never more than 2 directional inputs max, they're easy to remember, and there's only like 7 total in the whole game. I mean, the sword dash move is pretty much Dante's stinger attack right down to it being the same input, so if it's good enough for that, it's good enough for this. Of course, where Zan is a little different to Dante is in his speed and controls. Now, Zan isn't exactly the smoothest controlling character out there. Running around is a little rigid to say the least, but it's not exactly bad per se. Once again, I don't know if it's the amount of PS1 games that I play in the regular, but I found moving and platforming pretty easy in this game, even if I can admit it's not exactly very good. On the other hand, one thing that took me a while to get used to was the game's camera and lock-on system. You see, in Rising Zan, you can lock onto enemies by pressing the L1 button, and if you tap the L1 button again while locked on, you swap between enemies. If you use this in conjunction with the L2 and R2 buttons, you can basically sidestep around and circle enemies, which is more or less what the game wants you to be doing. Thing is though, this lock-on system is very finicky. While it will lock onto enemies, it doesn't always face you towards enemies, nor will it face the camera towards enemies either. In fact, the only control you have over the camera in this game is by holding L1, which will center the camera in front of you, and very slowly at that. Now, given the pace at which this game moves and how many enemies can gang up on you and how easy it is to get the camera stuck in an awkward position, you're probably gonna struggle with this a lot early on. In fact, I'd say this is one of the most janky and awkward cameras and lock-on systems that I've probably ever seen in a game, at least until I got used to it. Truthfully, I don't think the camera and lock-on in this game is as bad as it first seems really. It's certainly not great, not even good even. I think it's just very unusual. The problem is, if you go in expecting a traditional lock-on system, you're going to quickly get flustered and lose track of your character quite easily. The lock-on in this game requires careful positioning and timing in some cases, and when you start to understand its quirks, I actually found it could work quite well, to the point where I started getting quite comfortable with and actually really enjoying the combat. It almost looks like I really know what I'm doing here, and honestly, that's half the battle. So much of the combat in this game comes down to watching the enemies for openings, controlling your positioning, making sure to time your attacks to deal big damage, continue to pressure enemies, and also give yourself enough space to avoid and block counterattacks. There's a nice ebb and flow to it once you kinda know what you're doing, and once you nail that stuff down, everything else is really just a treat. Killing fodder enemies lets you build up your hustle gauge to unleash hustle mode and rain down attacks with a giant sword while running around at high speeds, which never really gets old. You can pick up various different ammos to deal massive damage with your gun against bigger enemies. Hell, even your standard bullets can deal massive damage in this game if you use it properly, especially if you use the special gun attack that auto-fires it like a machine gun. The game's quick-time events are called all-button events, which unsurprisingly let you use nearly every single button on the controller to bash away. And normally, I'm not a fan of games overusing button bashing segments, but there's never a time in this game where a quick-time event isn't hilarious or badass, whether you're facing some ninjas in a bell-ringing contest or slicing up a boss. It is always a good time. By the way, throughout the game's 9 levels, you're gonna fight a bunch of bosses too, which are probably the highlight of the game for me. These fights often offer up unique patterns and gimmicks to keep them fresh, and when you beat them, you enter into one final all-out attack to do as much damage as you can to get a point bonus at the end, and then you cut them into a number of different pieces depending on how well you did. I don't know how good Ultra Sexy Hero is, but I don't care. That's good enough for me. Anyway, I suppose we should take some time to talk about the game's visuals and presentation too. Now, from a pure technical and graphical standpoint, I think the game is fine. It's certainly a little rough around the edges, but to its credit, the performance is pretty solid. But you are going to see a lot of graphical glitches, some dodgy textures, the odd bit of clipping, especially on the characters, and the level design is truthfully quite limited throughout the game, usually bringing you from one simple room to the next. But even though this game isn't the most polished thing around, I think the zaniness of its characters, the environments, and the obstacles that you're going to come up against in this game completely distract you from the game's less polished aspects and just leave you with a big dumb smile on your face instead. And a big part of this comes down to the sound as well. Now, this game is fully voiced and the characters who speak in English do a fun, suitably cheesy job, but it's the enemies and side characters that really steal the show for me. Be it the hostages that you can rescue, the singing ninjas, or just whatever the hell this guy is saying. I cannot get enough of this. I love it so much. The music is also really rather good too. Obviously you can't top the amazing opening theme or the hustle mode music, but some of the levels and bosses have great tracks in their own right. I wouldn't say the game is filled wall to wall with bangers or anything, but the music isn't just silly campy fun. It's not afraid to turn up the tempo when the action heats up, let me tell you. So, when all is said and done, Rising Zan's 9 levels shouldn't take you much more than 90 minutes to 2 hours to beat, and truthfully, once I got the hang of the combat and camera, it ended up being pretty easy too, but fear not. Beating the game doesn't just unlock you a brand new hard mode, but a whole new character to play through the game with as well, called Sapphire, a side character from the main game, who's equipped with an entirely different moveset to boot. And with even harder modes to unlock once you beat the game again, medals to get for reaching higher rankings, and even more secrets, it is safe to say, if you liked what Rising Zan has to offer, there is plenty more to keep you busy. So, needless to say, I had a really good time playing this game, although that being said, this is very much a game that's, let's just say, right up my alley. Being a fan of these silly, over-the-top action games like God Hand, like No More Heroes, it's only natural I would gravitate towards this game, but at the same time, I must stress that while this game is a lot of fun, it is also about as PS1 as they come, and the control scheme, combat, camera and lock-on system will be a massive turn off to some people, that is a fact. But I'm gonna defend all that stuff too. It's certainly not terrible, it's just different. Take your time, be patient and try to understand it properly, and I think you'll find this game plays a little better than some people would give it credit for. In fact, you might even say it's pretty good. Certainly not great, but when the game's this fun, who really cares, you know? Rising Zan the Samurai Gunman certainly isn't a game for everybody, but if you really love and appreciate the experimental nature and zaniness of early 3D games, even with all their faults, this trip into the Wild West isn't one that you should miss out on. Well, there you have it, folks. That's a wrap on our first ever Obscure and Forgotten PS1 Games viewer special. Quite a fun selection of games, I think you'll agree, and not a PAL exclusive in sight. What a time to be alive. Today we got to check out a very noisy game about a very quiet bomber, a game where you play as a computer virus and get shot by Windows Defender a bunch, I don't know, a platformer about a purple-haired man with a vacuum guitar taking on the devil, and finally a game that features hands down the best singing ninjas this side of the Old West. Now, of course, we can't finish up without first assigning each game a ranking using the arbitrary ranking system I devised because ranking stuff is fun. Do I consider any of today's games a must-play? Should you give them a try if you like the look of them? Were any of the games just kinda meh? Or are any of the games trash and not worth your time at all? Well, today's viewer selection see Johnny Bazookatone fall into the meh tier, RayCrisis and Rising Zan the Samurai Gunman making their way into try tier, and Silent Bomber blasting its way into the must-play section. When it comes to Johnny Bazookatone, I get the feeling people might think I'm being a little soft on this one by putting it into the meh tier, and honestly, yeah, this game could fit quite comfortably into the trash tier for a lot of people. It's got a whole host of flaws, from its floaty and awkward controls to its confusing level design and inconsistent graphical elements, but a part of me still had an okay time with this game by the end. It has some enjoyable visuals, the occasional fun moment, and the soundtrack has some absolute gems within it. It's not really a game I would recommend to anybody, but if you like 2D platformers and can pick it up relatively cheap, it is absolutely not the worst game in the world by any means. Plus, that hover gun move is really cool. I don't care what anybody says. RayCrisis, plain and simple, is a very good vertical shoot 'em up. It is very tough and pretty short, even by shoot 'em up standards, but it is very, very good. And while it doesn't necessarily push the genre or try anything too new or exciting, what it does have is solid fundamentals and one hell of a striking visual aesthetic, making you feel like you're playing a video game that would have been featured in the movie Hackers. Throw in some top tier graphics, 60 FPS gameplay, and a banging soundtrack, and really, this is a shoot 'em up that you can't really go wrong with, and that goes for any game in the Ray series, really. Just be prepared to pay out your ass for a physical copy, especially in the West, but hey, that's shmups, baby. As for Rising Zan the Samurai Gunman, I think this game is amazing. It's funny, it's campy, it doesn't take itself seriously in the slightest, and at the same time, it's one of the most forward-thinking and experimental action games around. Its only problem is that for all the great ideas it had, it's still rife with some of the teething pains of early 3D gaming, meaning a lot of its greatness is stuck behind some very outdated controls and a camera that came straight from the depths of hell. But honestly, I say bite the bullet, play the training mission, learn the moves, and just embrace the jank, and you will find this is one of the PlayStation's most charming, forward-thinking, and batshit insane video games that is absolutely worth the odd bit of frustration it will almost definitely cause you. And finally, Silent Bomber. Now, look, I kind of knew ahead of time this was going to end up in the must-play category, and you can call me biased all you like, but really, I'm surprised by how much more I enjoyed this game all these years later, and I think it comes down to the fact it's such a fast-paced, challenging, and unique gameplay experience that to this day, still kind of feels like nothing else I've ever played, and in many ways it doesn't even feel like a PS1 game. Like, you could spruce this up with some 4K graphics, slap on a bit of ray tracing, and keep the gameplay the exact same, and honestly it would still be a blast. Pun intended. Throw in a serious yet not so serious story, some great boss battles, that really cool 2-player battle mode, and some replayability with the unlocks and mission rankings, and even with my somewhat mixed feelings on the music, which to its credit is pretty great, I just wish it was better. And yeah, this is a game that a lot of people love for good reason, and the fact it's still considered an obscurity all these years later is a crying shame. Everybody should have this game in their PS1 library, and if you don't get on it right now, it's certainly not going to get any cheaper. I mean, Metal Jesus got to it back in 2020, so good luck with that. Now, of course, we can't forget to give a special shout out to the wheels chosen in this episode. Red Fox and Terra Corrupt for Silent Bomber, Jetwolf 68K for RayCrisis, Parka Monkey for Johnny Bazookatone, and finally Paul Durst for Rising Zan the Samurai Gunman. Thank you all for some excellent choices. I hope you guys at home had as much fun watching them as I did playing them. We will of course be moving back to the regular format for our next volume, but if you want to throw in a game for selection and haven't done so already, throw it in the comments and I'll make sure we get it added. Anyway guys, I hope you enjoyed today's viewer special, and thank you so much for sticking with me throughout 10 volumes of Obscure and Forgotten PS1 games. Of course, this probably gives away what's going to happen in Volume 10 of Japan Only PS1 games, so make sure to join me again soon for another viewer special. And trust me, there are some absolute classics in that Japanese viewer wheel, so you are not going to want to miss that. Until then though, as always, take care of yourselves, thank you so much for watching, and don't forget to praise the wheel.